All right, good afternoon. I'm going to be doing a second presentation of the book Cold Comfort Farm for you guys. So I had a nice picture up here for my on my slide, but it hasn't come through, unfortunately. But the quote is what counts on the slide. There's a point at the beginning of the book where Gibbons quotes Jane Austen, who wrote many famous Victorian novels. And she uses a quote of hers saying, "Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery." And that kind of gives you an insight into what Gibbon's aim is with the book. Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. What she wants to focus on is the funny side of life. A lot of modernist texts tend to be very heavy, very serious, and hard to understand, but what Gibbons is trying to do is make people laugh and see the world from a comedic perspective. We spoke about this a bit last time. And just to recap, one of the ways she does that is through parody, through undermining received ideas. This is a kind of a break away from modernism. And I'm not even sure she would have seen herself necessarily as a typical modernist kind of writer, because she isn't all that experimental in the way that Eliot or Woolf or Henry James were. I think she's trying to be more appealing to a mass audience, and one way she does that is through humor. The modernism that she inhabits is one of trying to, as we'll see, trying to drag a large audience of readers into the future with it, to kind of leave behind literature of the past because it's silly and incorrect, and give people a new way of understanding the world around them. So that make it new aspect is a strong part of her work, I would say. We also spoke about, if you look in the slide here, you'll see it says that what Cold Comfort Farm is, that it is a well-sustained parody of the Lohmann Love Child school of fiction. So what does that actually mean? Sorry, I'm having issues with my slides here. That doesn't want to pull through all the things that I want to show on my side, but basically I had a definition of the Lohmann Love Child school of fiction. You can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. But it's the kind of over-the-top, extremely serious, melodramatic, soap operatic story of agricultural life, and that's what she's making fun of, basically. Today we're going to look at a few examples and characters in the book where she has that fun, looking at the parody, looking at a few scenes of parody in them, and really focusing, I think, largely on the characters of Adam, Aunt Ada Doom, and then a little bit about a religion. Okay, so I'm not going to go massively in depth in this. I'm just going to point you to parts in the book that you should really read, that are useful to draw examples out of when you write your POE and your essay. And I think that really capture the spirit and the whole aim of the book in general, right? You might notice that the book actually doesn't really start with the story immediately. It doesn't start with the narration. It actually starts with a weird letter that Stella Gibbons, the author of the book, writes to, I think it's like an editor or a literary agent who's she hopes can help her to get the following book published, right? But it's also in a way a kind of a satirical example of parody, that the kind of letter you would write sucking up and flattering an editor in order trying to get him to publish your book. But what it also does is this kind of modernist thing where it's kind of like with Henry James, the same thing with maybe Eliot, is that it's highlighting in the reader's mind the fact that what you're looking at is a text. It is a story, right? Just like Henry James is always reminding you that you're reading a story within a story within a story. Here, this letter kind of almost distances you from the text and says that what you're reading is something created, that it's a creation. It's a point of view. It is itself a text. And you should always be reminded that what you're reading here is not the capital T truth necessarily, but rather my own highly subjective individual viewpoint on something. And that's a very modernist idea, to reject the idea that literature captures the single universal truth, that there is one perspective that is right and all the others are wrong, rather that there are multiple perspectives you can bring to bear in how you think about something, a concept, or how you look at reality itself can be looked at from many different angles, some of which are probably wrong, some of which are almost right, but that life is more complicated than just adopting the easiest path of least resistance viewpoint on the world. That's not really how we arrive at truth or making sense of things. So that the letter's funny. It's kind of a part of the parody, but as I've just kind of tried to show you, it's also got a serious, more philosophical thing going on as well. So as we're going to be looking at in these examples I'll share with you today, we're going to focus on like the perspective that Flora brings in the book. She's the heroine, and the book is mostly told through her perspective. It's not a first person narration. It's like a close third person narration, but we basically see her moving through the world. And what she does is that she always kind of alerts the characters and the readers to the fact that the people in the book are behaving like people behave in books. And that if they simply behave like people behave in real life, a lot of their problems would simply go away, because their problems are actually imagined. The problems that they have come from literature, come from culture, and not actually from real life. And her book is always to be this corrective to their illogical, silly, mad ways. She often points out all the ways in which people are behaving like characters or caricatures rather than actual people. And in applying this modern common sense, their overwrought and self-inflicted problems will actually just go away, right? So she often demonstrates how ridiculous the cliched attitudes or behaviors of people are, how silly they are, and how if they simply just stopped acting like book characters, their lives would be instantly better. So what she's kind of trying to show in the book is that a lot of what we know simply comes from culture, and a lot of culture comes from our stories we tell, but the stories are constructs. They're just frameworks, and very often are underpinned by ideas that actually don't hold up in reality, right? So that's what she's very often doing. You'll see her working in this mode from about chapter 3 or so. There's this long kind of description of the farm, and the writing is really exaggerated, over the top. It's kind of ridiculously stupid. It's kind of the way that a bad writer would describe an agricultural environment as being sort of horrible. Like if you look here, I'm not going to mention page numbers because I'm reading it off an EPUB here, and I think we're all going to be working off different pages. I'm just going to point you to parts in the chapters, but really in the first page, I think, of chapter 3, you'll find all of this kind of ridiculous over-the-top writing, like the farm was crouched on a bleak hillside, whence its fields fanged with flints dropped steeply to the village of Howling a mile away. Its stables and outhouses were built in the shape of a rough octangle surrounding the farmhouse itself, which was built in the shape of a rough triangle. The left point of the triangle abutted on the farthest point of the octangle, which was formed by the cowsheds, which lay parallel with the big barn. So she uses all of these kind of ridiculous descriptive words like octangle, parallel, triangle. Everything is very bleak, and she uses this kind of old-fashioned Victorian language like whence, fanged flints, and just it's deliberately on purpose an example of bad writing, because it's so over the top, it's so descriptive that it actually becomes illogical. Like I can't, it's got all of these sort of precise words about triangles, octangles, parallels, and all the rest of it, but in my head I actually can't make any sense of what she's saying. But she's doing that on purpose as a parody of that kind of over-the-top bad writing that so dominated literature of the time. Another good example of this would be the character of Adam Lambsbreath. So again, you get a nice little joke kind of in his name itself, Lambsbreath. It's just about believable as a name that a farmer might have, but it's also totally silly and dumb. Lambsbreath. And she does this a lot with names like Stark Adders or Aunt Ada Doom. There's a young girl who lives on the farm called Elfine because she's kind of a lot like a free-spirited elf. And Adam Lambsbreath is kind of the name you might expect a worker or a laborer on the farm to have. And that's what he is. He's kind of like he's a laborer on the farm. He's not a member of the Starkadder family, but he's been working on the farm for some ridiculous amount of time, like 80 years or something, just as a dog's body, as a servant, almost as a kind of like a slave nearly. And the way he's described in chapter 3 is also very kind of deliberately and ostentatiously over the top and bad and suffering, because he's being modeled here on the kind of character that would appear in those Lohmann Lovechild books as this sort of extremely tortured, downtrodden, but also very stupid and dumb servant who works on the farm. If you look in chapter 3, the way it's described is the sound, there's a sound, he's working on the farm, there's a tortured bellow, a blaring welter of sound that shattered the quiescence of the morning, tore away across the yard and died away in a croak that was almost a sob. It was big business, the bull waking to another day in the clammy darkness of his cell. The sound woke Adam. He lifted his head from the flank of Feckless and looked around him in bewilderment for a moment. Then slowly his eyes, which looked small and wet and lifeless in his primitive face, lost their terror as he realized that he was in the cowshed, that it was 6:30 on a winter morning, and that his gnarled fingers were about the task which they had performed at this hour and in this place for the last 80 years and more. He stood up sighing and crossed over to Pointless, who was eating Graceless's tail. Adam, who was linked to all dumb brutes by a chain forged in soil and sweat, took it out of her mouth and put it into it instead his handkerchief, the last he had. She mumbled it while he milked her, and stealthily spat it out as soon as he passed on to Aimless and concealed it under the reeking straw with her hoof. She did not want to hurt the old man's feelings by declining to eat his gift. There was a close bond, a slow, deep, primitive, silent, down-dragging link between Adam and all living beasts. They knew each other's simple needs. They lay close to the earth, and something of the earth's old fierce simplicities had seeped into their being. So here's like, again, it's very over-the-top, overwrought, kind of overcooked writing and description of this character, trying to make him seem as extreme and therefore as ridiculous an example of this kind of agricultural novel character as you can possibly get. Everything is so silly. All those names, by the way, Pointless, Graceless, Feckless, Big Business, these are all names of bulls and cows on the farm that Adam is meant to look after every day and has been doing so for the last 80 years that he's worked on the farm. So just kind of very over the top and silly. And this is the scene in which he's also being given instructions by Judith Starkadder, the kind of maternal figure on the farm, the wife of Amos, to go pick up Flora Post at the train station. And Adam becomes a kind of like one of the first people that Flora tries to fix, because Adam's so miserable, he's so downtrodden, his life is so terrible, and Flora kind of shows him all the ways in which it doesn't need to be. For example, every single morning Adam has to make the whole family breakfast, and every morning he makes the family the same breakfast, which is burnt porridge. And every morning he has to clean out the pot the burnt porridge is made in, and he cleans out the pot, this huge pot, with a little twig. So even something like washing the dishes becomes this gargantuan and very unpleasant task for him to do. And what Flora does there is just she buys him a proper brush to clean the pot with, and so makes his life a lot easier. Instead of behaving like a cliche, she makes him behave with common sense, and so turns his life around, right? also want to look in the same chapter at the description of the Starkadder. So these are the kind of the men of the farm. Again, you'll see a very similar thing going on here. As she introduces all of these different men. The meal for the men was set on a long trestle at the farther end of the kitchen, as far away from the fire as possible. They came into the room in awkward little clumps, 11 of them. 5 were distant cousins of the Starkadders, and 2 were half-brothers of Amos, Judith's husband. This left only 4 men who were not in some way connected with the family. So it'll be readily understood that the general feeling among the farmhands was not exactly one of hilarity. Mark Delure, one of the 4, had been heard to remark, "Happen it had been another kind of 11, us might have had a cricket team with beef umpire, but as it is, it would have been benefiting if he was to hire ours for carrying coffins at 6 pence a mile." Okay, she writes that part, the dialogue of these characters, in a kind of what you would call, I guess, an accented English. In Britain, England, the regions farmers live in are kind of known for having a particular kind of English accent, which is itself is regarded as being a kind of a lower class or undereducated accent associated with people, especially back then. And so she's kind of reproducing, again, in a very ridiculous way, the words, the accent, and the idioms that the characters use, but they're kind of, again, very silly, over the top, and sort of like how it actually would have sounded, but also she uses a lot of her artfulness to exaggerate it and make it seem just a bit overcooked again. A strong family, I'm reading again here from the book, a strong family likeness wavered in and out of the fierce earth-reddened faces of the 7 like a capricious light. Micah Starkadder, mightiest of the cousins, was a ruined giant of a man, paralyzed in one knee and wrist. His nephew, Erk, was the little red, hard-bitten man with foxy ears. Erk's brother, Ezra, was of the same physical type, but horsey, where Erk was foxy. Caraway, a silent man, wind-shaved and lean, with long, wandering fingers, had some of Seth's animal grace. This had been passed on to his son, Harkaway, a young, silent, nervous man given to bursts of fury, but very little when you came to sift matters. Amos's half-brothers, Luke and Mark, were thickly built and highly featured, gross, silent men with an eye to the bed and the board. When all was seated, 2 shadows darkened the sharp, cold light pouring in through the door. They were no more than a growing imminence of humanity, but the porridge boiled over again. Amos, his eldest son, Reuben, came into the kitchen. Amos was even larger and more of a wreck than Micah, silently put his pruning snoot and reaping hook in a corner by the fender, while Reuben put the scranlet with which he had been plying down beside them. The 2 men took their places in silence, and after Amos had muttered a long and fervent grace, the meal was eaten in silence. Seth sat moodily tying and untying a green scarf around the magnificent throat he had inherited from Judith. He did not touch his porridge, and Judith only made a pretense of eating hers, playing with her spoon, patting the porridge up and down and idly building castles with the burnt bits. Her eyes burned under their penthouses, sometimes straying towards Seth as he sat sprawling in the lusty pride of casual manhood with a good many buttons and tapes undone. Then those same eyes, dark as prisoned king cobras, would slide around until they rested upon the bitter white head and raddled red neck of Amos, her husband, and then, like praying mantises, they would retreat between their lids. Secrecy pouted at her full mouth. So there again, the sense of like really over-the-top writing. Also these hints of like incest. Seth and Judith are actually son and mother, but there's this obvious sexual tension between them. And again, that's something Gibbons is mocking or making fun of, as always being this constant theme that was overdone all the time in these novels of agricultural life in England. But you get a sense of the characters all being these kind of run down, destroyed, unhappy, miserable people who eat burnt porridge every day of their lives in silence and without any kind of joy. Everything is dark and upsetting. And the dynamic of the book is that Flora comes into this dark, morose environment and turns it around and makes it happy again. But again, pointing out that a lot of what the characters are doing is just inhabiting the roles of characters in a book, and that if they simply break out of them, they develop the consciousness of like the modern world, that then they will be free of this stuff. Okay. And then maybe one of the more important characters in the book is Aunt Ada Doom. Okay. She is a tortured old woman who lives upstairs in the farmhouse and refuses to leave the farm, refuses to leave her room, and also won't let anybody else leave Cold Comfort Farm either. She's this very like psychologically dominating, bullying figure in the story. She's a kind of a representation of Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre, the kind of crazy woman who lives upstairs and who's kind of like a secret, but a dark secret, and is this kind of psychologically tortured person whose trauma festers and leaks out to dominate the entire family living below her, right? And again, it's as you might imagine, based on everything I've said already, this is a very kind of over the top and ridiculous depiction, just ridiculous enough that it provokes readers familiar with this cliche or trope to see that the Bertha Mason thing is a trope and a cliche, that it's something that happens in books, but it's not something that actually happens in real life. And that people should be careful not to, believe the things that happen in books, because that's not real life. So this is in I think I'm in chapter 4 here. And I'm just going to read this part where where Adam explains to Flora what's going on with Aunt Ada Doom. Adam always calls Flora Robert Post's child, because Robert Post was Flora's father, and there's this he's kind of speaking to her in a very formal, subservient way. He addresses her not by her name, but by her father's name, Robert Post's child. And he says to her, there's a curse on Cold Comfort Farm. Cold Comfort Farm is cursed. And she says, indeed. What sort of a curse? Is that why everything's so gone to seed and whatnot? There's no seeds, Robert Post's child. That's what I'm telling you. The seeds wither as they fall into the ground, and the earth will not nourish them. The cows are barren, and the sows are barren, and the king's evil, and the queen's bane, and the prince's heritage ravages our crops. Because why? Because there's a curse on us, Robert Post's child. But look here, couldn't something be done about it? I mean, surely Cousin Amos could get a man down from London or something, or perhaps Cousin Amos could sell the farm and buy another one without any curse on it in Berkshire or Dorsetshire. Adam shook his head. Nay, there have always been Starcadders at Cold Comfort. It's impossible for any of us to dream of leaving here. There's reasons why we can't. Mrs. Starkadder, she sought in us staying here. 'Tis her life, 'tis the life in her veins. Cousin Judith, do you mean? Well, she doesn't seem very happy here. Nay, Robert Post's child, I mean the old lady, old Mrs. Starkadder. His voice sunk to a whisper so that Flora had to bend her tall head to catch the last words. Is she dead, then? Asked Flora, who was prepared to hear anything at Cold Comfort, even that all the family was kept in order by a domineering ghost. Adam laughed, a strange sound like the whickering snicker of a teasel in anger. Nay, she's alive, right enough. Her hand lies on us like iron, Robert Post, child. But she never leaves her room, and she never sees no one but Miss Judith. She's never left the farm this last 20 years. He stopped suddenly, as though he had said too much. He began to withdraw to his dark corner of the kitchen. I mun clatter the dishes now. Leave me in peace, Robert Post's child. Oh, all right, but I do wish you would call me Miss Post or even Miss Flora if you'd rather be all feudal. I do feel that Robert Post's child every time is rather a mouthful, don't you? Leave me in peace, I might clatter the dishes. Seeing that he was really bent on doing some work, Flora let him be and thoughtfully finished her breakfast. So that was what it was. Mrs. Starkadder was the curse of cold comfort. Mrs. Starkadder was the dominant grandmother theme, which was found in all typical novels of agricultural life and sometimes in novels of urban life too. It was, of course, right and proper that Mrs. Starkadder should be in possession at Cold Comfort. Flora should have suspected her existence from the beginning. So that you have, like, even within the story, you have this acknowledgement of literature itself, the dominant grandmother theme, right? Kind of making fun of how we literature students and scholars analyze literature looking for themes, and the crazy woman, the dominant grandmother, the hysterical female. These are always things you find in this kind of book, but you only find them in books. You don't actually find them in the real life. And this all is kind of a big made up, pretentious thing. And because it's made up and pretentious, it's easy to parody and make fun of. Right. So the reason that Aunt Ada Doom is the dominant grandmother is another kind of joke within the story, is that when she was growing up as a little girl living on Cold Comfort Farm, she had seen something nasty in the woodshed. And that is what it made her different. It's never described what it was that she'd seen in the woodshed, but as a little girl, she opened a woodshed one day and saw something in there that she wasn't supposed to. It's kind of intimated that it's like a sex thing, but never actually directly said. What is being made fun of there is the kind of the psychological torture that people take on. Like you experience something bad or shocking as a child, and then for the rest of your life, you are psychologically wounded by that idea. This is a kind of a Freudian thing. I've mentioned Freud a bit as being part of the modernist wave, but here she's actually making fun of that kind of Freudian reading of things, right? That it's ridiculous. Just because you experience something bad or you saw something you shouldn't have seen when you're a child doesn't mean that for the rest of your life you have to be psychologically wounded and disabled by that experience as she is. It's completely ridiculous. And that misery then extends to the whole farm, the whole family, which forces the Starkadders to live out these miserable lives on their miserable farms, right? Flora describes Aunt Ada Doom as being conveniently mad, right? So it's not that she's actually mad. She's just, in a way, pretending to be mad because that's what you are supposed to be if you are the kind of person Aunt Ada Doom is. But if she just realized that her madness was made up, then she'd be able to overcome it. And indeed, by the end of the book, she does, because Flora Post offers her a way out of her own psychological torture. Okay. Then last thing before I wrap up this class for the day is, I'm not going to go over this in any detail, but just to point it out to you, I think chapter 8 of the book is probably the best chapter in the book and the funniest, because here we have a really satirical and funny takedown of religion in the book, right? The character of Amos is a kind of fire, and it turns out that his hobby, his kind of side interest, besides being a farmer, his side interest is being a fire and brimstone preacher on the side, and he preaches fire and damnation to this small flock of agricultural people in a church called the Quivering Brethren, which is a great name for a church. And he gets up and he preaches kind of fire and brimstone, damnation, tells everybody they're going to hell because they have bad thoughts. But the way it's described and done and narrated is very, very, I think, just plain funny, actually. So I guess these are all the things that Gibbons kind of is looking at, all these things that that fall under her very satirical eye and vision. There's like, literature, culture, psychology, religion as well. All of these things she looks at and finds a reason to laugh at and portray as being a bit silly. Okay. So all these instances where you see that happening are examples of parody, satire, that you can use in answering the question for your PhD. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Gone on a while. I'm going to do one more class online for this. Probably a shorter one as I wrap up the book. So look out for one more class after this, and I'll chat to you guys again soon. Until then, do stay well and keep reading the book. Cheerio.